February 1941. At the horn-shaped tip of Africa, in the rugged mountains of Eritrea, British soldiers faced what seemed like an impossible mission. The massive cliffs rising before them were already laced with Italian defensive lines. Every hill, every pass was fortified with machine gun nests. And the order given to these soldiers was simple: capture these impenetrable positions. But wait, this isn't your standard war story. This is an epic tale of heroism that history forgot, but should never be forgotten. If I asked you, what was the bloodiest infantry battle of World War II? Most of you would say Stalingrad, maybe Normandy. But listen to the words that came from General Archibald Wavell himself. The Battle of Keren was the toughest infantry fighting this war has seen. These weren't words of praise. They were a tribute to the soldiers who shed their blood there. And if this channel has taught you anything, it's this: true stories of heroism don't lie in the dusty pages of textbooks. They lie on forgotten battlefields. And Keren was exactly that kind of battlefield. Now I want to ask you something. As you watch this video, put yourself in those soldiers' shoes. Imagine trying to climb a steep cliff in 40-degree heat, without water, without sleep, under enemy fire. And then decide, does this story deserve to be told or not? Let's begin. But before we start, make sure to subscribe and like. Thank you. Now on to our story. In early 1941, the world was passing through a dark period. Europe was being crushed under the boot of Nazi Germany. France had fallen. Britain was an island nation standing alone under German bombardment. But the war wasn't only in Europe. A critical struggle was also unfolding in Africa. And one of the most important scenes of this struggle would take place somewhere most people have never even heard of: Eritrea. At that time, Eritrea was part of Italian East Africa. Mussolini's fascist Italy had controlled this region since the 1890s, and when World War II began, they turned it into a strategic base. Why? Because Eritrea dominated the Red Sea, and the Red Sea was the gateway to the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was the lifeline of the British Empire. All maritime traffic from India, Australia, and the Far East passed through this canal. If the Italians gained control of the Red Sea, Britain's connection to its colonies could be severed. That would be a disaster capable of changing the course of the war. That's why Winston Churchill declared the destruction of the Italian presence in Africa a priority objective. And this task fell on the shoulders of General Archibald Wavell. Wavell was one of the British Army's most brilliant generals. He had lost an eye in World War I, but that hadn't slowed him down. Now, with limited resources, he had to defend a vast geography while simultaneously driving the Italians out of Africa. Wavell's plan was bold. An offensive would be launched from Sudan into Eritrea. The target was Asmara, Eritrea's capital, and most importantly, the port of Massawa on the Red Sea coast. But to reach this objective, one obstacle had to be overcome first: Keren. Keren was a small town hidden among the mountains in northern Eritrea. But what really mattered was its location. The town sat inside a narrow valley that could only be entered from two sides. Both entrances were surrounded by high mountains. The most important of these mountains were Sanchil, Briggs Peak, Fort Dologorotic, and the Zaban Heights. Whoever controlled these peaks controlled the valley, and whoever controlled the valley controlled the road to the heart of Eritrea. The Italians were well aware of this reality. They had done everything in their power to defend Keren. Italian forces under General Luigi Frusci had practically taken root in these mountains. Machine gun nests carved into the rocks, concrete bunkers, barbed wire and minefields, every hill had been transformed into a fortress, and the soldiers defending these fortresses were not to be underestimated. Yes, the Italian army is generally known for its poor performance in World War II, but the Italian forces in Eritrea were different. These troops had lived in this land for years, adapted to the climate and terrain, and were determined to fight. They also had Eritrean Askari units alongside them. These local soldiers were extremely experienced in mountain warfare. Now let's look at the British side. The force tasked with attacking Keren consisted of the 4th and 5th Indian Divisions. Yes, you heard that right. The majority of these divisions were made up of Indian soldiers. But when I say Indian, don't just think of modern-day India. At that time, British India also encompassed what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Myanmar. These divisions included Sikhs, Punjabis, Gurkhas, Rajputs, and soldiers from many other ethnic groups. And of course, British officers and British units were also an important part of this force.
At this point, something needs to be said. The strength of the British Empire lay in its ability to unite people from different nations around a common purpose. The soldiers fighting at Keren had come from all corners of the world. They spoke different languages, believed in different gods, ate different foods. But they all wore the same uniform and fought against the same enemy. This was a coalition force in the truest sense, and the success of this coalition was proof of British leadership and organization. The task of attacking Keren was given to General William Platt. Platt was the commander of British forces in Sudan and an experienced officer. With him were General Noel Beresford Pierce, commander of the 4th Indian Division, and General Lewis Heath, commander of the 5th Indian Division. These generals knew their forces were limited. Air support was scarce. Tank support was virtually non-existent. Artillery ammunition was restricted. But their orders were clear. Keren would be taken. In the first week of February, when British reconnaissance units approached Keren, the sight before them was heartbreaking. In front of them were cliffs, rising almost vertically. Enemy positions were visible on top of these cliffs, and to reach those positions, they would have to cross open ground. It looked like a suicide mission. But the British soldiers didn't back down. On February 2, 1941, the first attack began. The target was Briggs Peak, east of Keren. Taking this hill could open a breach in the Italian defensive line. The unit carrying out the attack was the Cameron Highlanders. This Scottish Highland regiment was one of history's oldest and most honored units. These soldiers had fought for the British Empire all over the world for centuries. And now, in this remote corner of Africa, they would write history once again. The Cameron Highlanders began advancing under cover of darkness. The plan was to reach the peak before dawn and catch the Italians by surprise. But the terrain was incredibly difficult. The rocks were sharp and slippery. Thorny bushes tore at their uniforms. And worst of all, the Italian sentries were extremely alert. Halfway up, the British soldiers were spotted, and all hell broke loose. Italian machine guns began spewing fire. In the darkness, tracer rounds danced across the rocks. The Cameron Highlanders continued advancing under this fire. Every step meant a casualty. Every meter was watered with blood. But they couldn't be stopped. By dawn, the Scottish soldiers had managed to reach the summit of Briggs Peak. But the victory was short-lived. When the Italians saw the peak had been lost, they launched a fierce counterattack, and the Cameron Highlanders didn't have the strength left to resist this counterattack. Ammunition was running out. The wounded couldn't be evacuated, and most importantly, there weren't enough soldiers to hold the peak. By sunset, the British were forced to withdraw. This first attack had ended in failure. But this failure taught the British commanders an important lesson. Keren couldn't be taken by direct assault. A smarter, more planned, more coordinated approach was needed. And they needed time to develop this approach. In mid-February, British forces regrouped. General Platt revised his plan. This time, a more comprehensive attack would be launched. Multiple peaks would be attacked simultaneously. Artillery support would be increased. And most importantly, the soldiers would be specially trained to fight in this difficult terrain. But the Italians weren't sitting idle either. With each passing day, they strengthened their defenses. More barbed wire, more mines, more concrete bunkers. Keren was becoming an impregnable fortress, and the burden of breaking through this fortress's gates would fall on the shoulders of British soldiers. This is where the second and bloodiest phase of the battle began. When March arrived, the Keren Valley would turn into a butcher's shop. And what was being cut in this butcher shop were the lives of young British and Indian soldiers. But before I continue this story, I want to say this. If you've watched this far and been moved by this story, please like this video and subscribe, because these likes help the algorithm bring stories like this to more people. And these heroes deserve to be remembered. Now we're moving toward the bloodiest days of the battle. Get ready, because what I'm about to tell you will show you the true face of war.
Welcome back to Part 2. We're continuing without slowing down. March 1941, the Keren Valley was about to become death's embrace. The failure of the first attack had deeply shaken the British commanders. The Cameron Highlanders' loss at Briggs Peak had revealed just how difficult this battle would be. But General William Platt was not a man who gave up. He was a commander who had served for years in Sudan's scorching heat and knew this land like the back of his hand. And now he was preparing a new plan to take Keren. Platt's new strategy was to pressure the Italian defensive line from multiple points rather than concentrating on a single one. The main targets were identified: Sanchill Hill, Fort de Loridoc, Briggs Peak, and the Zeben Heights. Capturing these 4 key points would mean breaking down the gates to the Keren Valley. But the price to be paid for breaking these gates would be heavier than anyone could yet comprehend. On the morning of March 1, 1941, as the sun rose behind the Eritrean mountains, British artillery opened fire. This was the beginning of the second phase of the battle. The artillery barrage lasted for hours. The mountain slopes were shaken by exploding shells. Clouds of dust and smoke covered the sky. British commanders hoped this bombardment would weaken the Italian positions, but they were wrong. The Italians had dug their positions deep into the rocks. Concrete bunkers wouldn't collapse unless directly hit, and artillery shells couldn't be fired with such precise accuracy. When the bombardment ended, Italian machine guns were still intact, and these machine guns were waiting for the advancing British soldiers. The unit carrying out the first wave attack was the 11th Indian Brigade, attached to the 4th Indian Division. This brigade included legendary units like the Rajputana Rifles, Punjab Regiment, and Marhatta Light Infantry. These soldiers had come from all corners of India. The Rajputs were a caste famous for their warrior tradition for centuries. The Punjabis were known as the toughest fighters of British India, and the Marhattas were descendants of a people who had founded one of the greatest empires in Indian history. These soldiers, under the command of British officers, were ready to die for the empire. The attack was directed at Sanchill Hill. Sanchill was one of the highest points overlooking the Keren Valley. Whoever controlled this hill would control the entire valley. But reaching the hill meant passing through hell. From the foot of the hill to its summit, there were hundreds of meters of open ground. This ground was within the field of fire of Italian machine guns, and every soldier who entered this killing field would come face to face with death. The soldiers of the Rajputana Rifles began advancing in the early morning hours. They had only their rifles and bayonets. No armor, no tank support. Just courage. And this courage was carrying them into death's embrace. Casualties began in the first 100 meters. Italian machine guns were working with terrible efficiency. With every volley, several more soldiers fell to the ground. But those who remained didn't stop. They kept advancing. 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters. Every step was watered with blood. Every meter cost a life. Halfway up the hill, a Rajput officer named Subadar Richpal Ram displayed extraordinary courage. His officer and most of his men had been shot. He himself was wounded in the leg, but he couldn't be stopped. He continued advancing despite his wounds. He encouraged his soldiers, "Advance! Don't stop! Victory will be ours!" he shouted. Ram's courage was contagious. Even wounded soldiers got up and continued the attack.
But courage couldn't stop bullets. The first attack on Sanchill Hill was repulsed with heavy casualties. The Rajputana Rifles lost hundreds of soldiers within a few hours. The remaining soldiers were forced to retreat, dragging their wounded with them. The Rajputana Rifles lost hundreds of soldiers within a few hours. The remaining soldiers were forced to retreat, dragging their wounded with them. The hill was still in Italian hands. But the British commanders didn't give up. That same day, a new attack was launched on Briggs Peak next to Sanchil. This time, the attacking unit was the Maratha Light Infantry, attached to the 5th Indian Division. The Marathas came from some of the most legendary warriors in Indian history. Their ancestors had brought the Mughal Empire to its knees, and now their descendants were attacking Italian positions. The Marathas' commander was British officer Lieutenant Colonel Ninham Taylor. Taylor trusted his soldiers. "These men were born in the mountains," he said. "Conquering mountains is in their blood." And Taylor was right. The Marathas moved with incredible agility on the cliffs. Despite Italian fire, they clung to the slopes of the hill. The attack began under cover of darkness. The Marathas silently climbed the cliffs. Under the moonlight, they moved like shadows. Italian sentries didn't spot them until the last moment, and when they did, it was too late. By dawn, the Marathas had reached the summit of Briggs Peak. They stormed Italian positions with grenades and bayonets. Close-quarters combat was the most brutal form of warfare. The sounds of gunfire, screams, and metal clashing mixed together. The Marathas cleared the hill inch by inch. By the time the sun fully rose, Briggs Peak was in British hands. But the victory was short-lived. When the Italians saw the peak had been lost, they launched a fierce counterattack. Artillery fire began raining down on Briggs Peak. The Marathas crouched in the trenches they had just captured. Ammunition was running low, water had run out, and Italian infantry was gathering at the foot of the hill. The counterattack began in the afternoon. Italian soldiers climbed the hill in waves. The Marathas fought to their last bullet. When the bullets ran out, they used bayonets. When bayonets bent, they fought with rifle butts. But the numbers were too uneven. Before evening, the Marathas were forced to retreat. Briggs Peak fell back into Italian hands. This cycle continued throughout March. The British would attack, capture a hill, then be pushed back by Italian counterattacks. Every attack cost hundreds of lives. Every retreat broke morale a little more. Keren had become a meat grinder. But in this meat grinder, extraordinary stories of heroism were also being written. One of the most striking of these stories involved the sappers of the 4th Indian Division. Sappers were the Army's engineer units. Building bridges, clearing mines, and removing obstacles was their job. And at Keren, they were given an impossible task: opening the Dongolas Gorge. The Dongolas Gorge was the main road entering the Keren Valley, but the Italians had completely blocked this pass. They had dynamited the cliffs to block the road. Tons of rock had made the pass impassable, and behind these rocks, minefields and machine gun nests waited. The sappers' mission was to clear these rocks and open the road to vehicle traffic, but they had to do this under enemy fire. Day and night, Italian snipers hunted the sappers. Every dynamite explosion attracted the enemy's attention, and attracting attention meant death. Sapper Subadar Singh was one of the heroes of this operation. Singh was a Sikh and never removed his turban. He told his soldiers, "Feel the fear, then ignore it," and he lived these words himself. Under enemy fire, he crawled among the rocks clearing mines. One day, a soldier next to him stepped on a mine. The explosion threw Singh several meters, but he got up, covered in blood, and continued working. He said, "We will open the road. No matter what, we will open it." And they did. After weeks of work, the Dongola Gorge was opened to traffic. This was one of the turning points of the battle. Now tanks and heavy artillery could enter the Keren Valley. But the price paid for the success was heavy. 1/3 of the sappers were killed or wounded in this operation. By mid-March, British commanders had developed a new strategy. Instead of scattered attacks, a coordinated major assault would be launched. All resources would be concentrated on a single point, Fort Dologorodok. Fort Dologorodok was a defensive complex built on an old Italian fortress. It was located on a strategic hill right in the middle of the Keren Valley. Taking this fortress would mean splitting the Italian defensive line in two, and the task of taking this fortress was given to the battle's most elite units. The attack began on the morning of March 15, 1941. British artillery pounded Fort Dologorodok for hours.
This time, the bombardment was much more intense. Artillery ammunition had been specially brought from Sudan. General Platt was putting everything into this attack. Following the bombardment, the infantry assault began. The lead unit was the Highland Light Infantry. This heroic Scottish regiment was determined to avenge the failure at Briggs Peak. Alongside them were the Gurkha units of the 4th Indian Division. Gurkhas. Everyone has heard this name. These warriors from the mountainous regions of Nepal were among the world's most feared soldiers. The legendary kukri knives in their hands were their enemy's nightmare. When a Gurkha drew his kukri from its sheath, it meant someone was going to die. And at Keren, kukris would be drawn from their sheaths. The attack came from 3 directions. The Highland Light Infantry advanced from the center, the Gurkhas from the right flank, the Marathas from the left flank. The Italians struggled to stop this coordinated attack. They were under pressure on every front, and for the first time, the defensive lines began to crack. The commander of the Highland Light Infantry was Lieutenant Colonel Ninham Taylor. Taylor was advancing on his horse ahead of his soldiers. This was an unusual sight in modern warfare, but Taylor wanted to inspire his soldiers. "Follow me," he shouted. "Today we will make history." And the soldiers followed him. Italian fire was intense, but the Highland Light Infantry couldn't be stopped. Scottish soldiers advanced to the melody of bagpipes. Yes, they were actually playing bagpipes. This was a centuries-old tradition of Scottish regiments. In battle, the sound of bagpipes gave soldiers courage, and at Keren, this tradition continued. Piper Duncan McIntyre was the bagpiper of the Highland Light Infantry. During the advance, a bullet struck McIntyre's bagpipe. The instrument shattered, but McIntyre didn't stop. He continued playing even with the torn sound, until another bullet hit him in the shoulder. He was wounded, but survived. After the battle, he was nominated for the Victoria Cross. The Gurkhas, meanwhile, were advancing like hell from the right flank. These Nepali warriors moved like lizards on the cliffs. When they got close to Italian positions, they drew their kukris, and then, silently, they descended into the trenches. The Gurkha assault was a nightmare for the Italians. These warriors, approaching in the darkness without making a sound, eliminated sentries one by one. They threw grenades into machine gun nests. They entered bunkers with kukris. By morning, the right flank had completely collapsed. Fort de la Goredoc fell into British hands on the morning of March 16, 1941. But the real battle was just beginning. The Italians didn't accept the loss of the fortress, and they launched one of history's bloodiest counterattacks.
The nights of March 16 to 17, what happened at Fort de la Goredoc was one of the most horrific pages in war history. The Italians attacked in waves. Every wave was repulsed with heavy casualties. But immediately after, a new wave came. British soldiers fired until their ammunition ran out. Then they used bayonets. When bayonets broke, they fought with rocks. And still they held on. One of the heroes of this resistance was Gurkha rifleman Ganju Lama. Lama was a machine gunner. His position was right in the middle of the Italian counterattack. All his comrades around him had been shot, but Lama didn't abandon his machine gun. For hours, alone, he repulsed enemy waves. When his ammunition ran out, he collected ammo from his dead comrades. When he was wounded, he bandaged his bleeding wounds himself, and he continued firing. Ganju Lama killed or wounded more than 50 Italian soldiers in the defense of Fort de la Goredoc. This extraordinary heroism earned him the Victoria Cross. One of the most glorious pages in Gurkha history was written at Keren. But the price was heavy. In the defense of Fort de la Goredoc, British and Indian soldiers suffered hundreds of casualties. The fortress changed hands twice over 2 days. Finally, on March 18, the British captured the fortress definitively. But this victory had cost thousands of lives. The fall of Fort de la Goredoc was the beginning of the end of Italian resistance. But the Italians were still fighting. Sanchil Hill and the Zeben Heights were still in their hands, and these positions also had to be taken. The last week of March saw the final major assault.
On March 25, 1941, British forces launched an all-out attack. This time, there was air support as well. Hurricane aircraft from the South African Air Force bombed Italian positions. Artillery fire shook the mountains, and the infantry rose to attack one last time. In this final assault, all units of the 4th and 5th Indian Divisions were mobilized. The Cameron Highlanders wanted revenge for the hills they had lost at the beginning of the battle. The Rajputana Rifles would not leave their martyrs' blood unavenged. The Gurkhas sharpened their kukris one last time, and the Marathas summoned the spirit of their ancestors. The attack began at dawn, and this time the Italians couldn't resist. The exhaustion of weeks of fighting, ammunition shortages, and moral collapse were wearing down the Italian defense. One by one, the hills began to fall. Sanchil Hill was captured on March 26, the Zeben Heights on March 27. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. On the evening of March 27, 1941, Italian commander General Luigi Frusci gave the order to retreat. Keren could no longer be defended. Italian forces began withdrawing toward Asmara. 53 days of hell had come to an end. But the Keren Valley greeted the victors with a scene that would never be forgotten. Every hill, every valley, every cliff was filled with bodies. British, Indian, Nepali, and Italian soldiers lay side by side. Death had made them equals, and the survivors would never forget this scene for the rest of their lives. The statistics revealed just how bloody Keren had been. British and Allied forces had suffered more than 4,000 killed and wounded. Italian casualties were twice that, approximately 8,000 soldiers killed or wounded. In 53 days, more than 12,000 people had shed their blood in this valley. General Wavell's words about the toughest infantry fighting were not said in vain. And at this point, I want to make a reminder. As you watch this video, don't forget that these stories are the stories of real people. Ganju Lama was a real person. Subedar Richpal Ram was a real person. Duncan McIntyre was a real person. And thousands of nameless heroes gave their lives in these mountains. Keeping their memory alive is our duty. By following this channel, you can help these stories reach more people. Now, let's look at the outcome and legacy of the battle, because the blood shed at Keren had to have a meaning, and we'll discover that meaning in Part 3. We're continuing without wasting any time.
Now we've arrived at the final part. Our story continues at full speed. March 27, 1941. As the sun set over the Keren Gully for the last time, 53 days of hell were finally coming to an end. Italian forces were retreating. Dusty roads were filled with tired and exhausted soldiers. What they left behind were destroyed positions, abandoned weapons, and countless bodies. And on the hills, British soldiers watched this scene in silence. No one was cheering. No one was shouting victory cries. There was only silence, a deep, heavy, weary silence. This silence reflected the price of victory, because the victory won at Keren was not the kind to be celebrated. This was the survivors' tribute to the dead. This was the hero's silent lament. But our story doesn't end here, because the fall of Keren wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the turning point of the war in Africa, and the consequences of this turning point would change the course of World War II. After the fall of Keren, Italian resistance quickly collapsed. British forces continued advancing without wasting any time. On April 1, 1941, just 5 days later, Eritrea's capital Asmara fell. The city surrendered with almost no resistance. The Italian garrison had lost the will to fight after the losses at Keren. The fall of Asmara was a strange experience for British soldiers. After crawling on rocks for weeks, coming face to face with death for every meter, they were now walking through the streets of a city. Shops were open. People were going about their daily business, as if a war where thousands had died just a few kilometers away had never happened. This contrast left deep marks on the soldiers' minds. A private from the Cameron Highlanders wrote in his diary, "While drinking coffee at Asmara's cafes, I thought of Tommy who died beside me 2 weeks ago. He lay covered in blood on a cliff while I'm here drinking coffee. Is this fair? No, but war was never fair." After Asmara, it was time for the real strategic objective, the port of Massawa.
Massawa was one of the most important ports on the Red Sea. The Italian Navy was stationed there, and capturing this port meant bringing the Red Sea under Allied control. General Platt was cautious as he advanced toward Massawa. He was worried that the Italians might have established strong defenses at the port. He didn't want to experience another Keren nightmare. But his concerns proved unfounded. The defeat at Keren had so demoralized the Italian commanders that the Massawa defense was merely symbolic. On April 8, 1941, Massawa fell. Italian commander Admiral Mario Bonetti scuttled his ships before surrendering the port. More than 15 Italian ships sank into the waters of Massawa harbor. This was a matter of honor. Bonetti preferred to destroy his ships with his own hands rather than surrender them to the enemy, but it didn't change the outcome. Massawa was now in British hands. The fall of Massawa was the beginning of the end for Italian East Africa. Eritrea had completely passed into Allied control. Now it was time to link up with British forces coming from the south. In Ethiopia, forces under General Alan Cunningham were advancing northward, and the meeting of these two forces would complete the collapse of Italian East Africa. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and like. In May 1941, Addis Ababa, the center of Italian East Africa, fell. Emperor Haile Selassie returned to his throne after 5 years of exile, and within a few months, Italian resistance ended completely. Mussolini's African empire had become history. This success had begun at Keren. The bloodshed in those mountains had made this outcome possible, and those who understood this best were the generals and politicians of the war. When Churchill heard of the Keren victory, he delivered an important speech in Parliament. Churchill, as always, used words masterfully. At Keren, our soldiers achieved the impossible. They overcame every obstacle that nature and the enemy placed before them. This victory is a triumph of British will and courage. Churchill's words weren't just propaganda. Churchill knew very well the strategic importance of Keren, because the victory won at Keren had triggered a chain reaction. The fall of Eritrea had made the Red Sea safe. The security of the Red Sea had opened the way to the Suez Canal, and the security of the Suez Canal had protected the lifeline of the British Empire. But more importantly, the Keren victory had come at a critical time. In the spring of 1941, Britain stood alone. America had not yet entered the war. The Soviets were in a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. France, Holland, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, Poland, and other European countries were under Nazi occupation. Britain was one of the last bastions still resisting alone. At exactly this moment, news of victory from Keren lifted the morale of the British people. For a nation that had received only bad news for months, Keren was a ray of hope. The thought, "we can win," began to sprout again in the hearts of the people. And this morale kept Britain standing even in the darkest days of the war.
General Archibald Wavell, when writing his report on the Battle of Keren, particularly emphasized the soldiers' sacrifice. Wavell wrote, "The courage I witnessed at Keren was at the highest level I have seen in my professional career. Our soldiers went beyond human limits. While struggling with thirst, hunger, exhaustion, and fear, they didn't hesitate for a moment. This victory is their victory." Wavell's assessment was shared by war historians as well. Basil Liddell Hart, one of the most respected historians of World War II, described Keren as the overlooked masterpiece of the war. According to Hart, the Battle of Keren contained extremely important lessons from tactical and strategic perspectives. One of these lessons was the importance of coordination. At Keren, soldiers from different nations fought in perfect harmony. British, Indians, Nepalese, South Africans, all were focused on the same objective. This coordination was the forerunner of modern coalition warfare. And this experience would later be applied at the Normandy landings and other major operations. Another lesson was the critical importance of logistics. At Keren, ammunition and supply shortages were a constant problem. Supply lines from Sudan were long and fragile.
This experience taught the British Army that logistics could determine the fate of a war, and this lesson would prove vital in subsequent battles in Africa. The fate of soldiers who fought at Keren diverged in different directions after the battle. Some were sent to other fronts of the war in Africa. They fought against Rommel in North Africa. At El Alamein, Tobruk, Tunisia, in the sands of Africa, they used the experience gained at Keren. Others were sent to much more distant fronts. The 4th and 5th Indian Divisions were later transferred to Burma. There they fought against the Japanese army. From the mountains of Keren to the jungles of Burma, these soldiers appeared in every corner of the war. The Gurkhas continued their legend after Keren. During World War II, more than 250,000 Gurkhas fought for Britain. Of these, 32,000 lost their lives, and dozens of Gurkhas won the highest medals for bravery, including the Victoria Cross. Ganju Lama at Keren was just one of these heroes. Scottish regiments like the Cameron Highlanders and Highland Light Infantry also played important roles throughout the rest of the war. At the Normandy landings, the liberation of Holland, the occupation of Germany, the sound of Scottish bagpipes echoed in every corner of Europe, and the veterans of these regiments never forgot Keren. Most of the surviving soldiers shared their memories years later. These memories revealed just how difficult Keren had been. A surviving soldier from the Rajputana Rifles said in an interview in the 1980s, "I saw hell at Keren, but at the same time, I saw how courageous humans can be. My friends who died beside me were the bravest people. Without them, I would have stayed there too." Another veteran from the Highland Light Infantry said, "Before Keren, I feared death. After Keren, I stopped being afraid, because I had seen the worst, and I survived. Nothing can scare me after that." These veterans' stories inspired post-war generations. The children and grandchildren of soldiers who participated in the Battle of Keren carried these stories as their heritage, and this legacy lives on even today. The Keren War Cemetery stands today as one of the most impressive monuments in Eritrea. The cemetery holds the graves of 440 soldiers who lost their lives in the battle. On each headstone is written a name, an age, a regiment name, and each stone represents a story. A son lost by a family, a husband lost by a wife, a father lost by a child. At the cemetery entrance stands a large memorial. These words are carved on it. "Those who lie here fought for freedom. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten." These words are simple but powerful, and every year visitors from around the world pay their respects before this monument. In Britain, the Battle of Keren is officially commemorated. The units that are successors to the Cameron Highlanders and Highland Light Infantry hold a special memorial ceremony every March. At these ceremonies, the names of Keren veterans are read one by one, and after each name, the words "never forgotten" are repeated. In India, too, the memory of Keren lives on. The Rajputana Rifles, Punjab Regiment, and other Indian regiments see Keren as part of their glorious history. In these regiments' museums, items brought from Keren are displayed. Maps, photographs, weapons, medals. Each item tells a story. In Nepal, the Gurkhas' heroism at Keren is a source of national pride. Ganju Lama's Victoria Cross is preserved as one of Nepal's most valuable historical artifacts, and young soldiers joining Gurkha regiments study the Battle of Keren as part of their training.
In South Africa, too, the memory of Keren lives on. The South African Air Force had played an important role at Keren. The story of the pilots who bombed Italian positions with Hurricane aircraft is considered an important chapter in South African aviation history. The Battle of Keren also has lessons for today's world. Perhaps the most important of these lessons relates to the concepts of resilience and determination.
At Keren, British and Allied forces faced countless difficulties. The terrain was impossible. Enemy positions were extremely strong. Casualties were heavy. At many points, retreating and giving up seemed logical. But these soldiers didn't give up. They fell, got up, attacked again, and eventually they succeeded. This is a lesson valid for every age. When we face life's difficulties, we can remember the soldiers at Keren. They went beyond human limits, and this shows that we can too. Another important lesson is the power of teamwork. At Keren, people from different nations, different religions, different cultures fought together. British, Indians, Nepalis, South Africans. They were all different, but they united around a common purpose, and this unity brought victory. In today's world, this lesson is more important than ever. Global problems require global cooperation. Keren shows that differences can be a strength, not a weakness. When different perspectives and different abilities come together, even goals that seem impossible can be achieved. And finally, perhaps the most important lesson, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The soldiers who fought at Keren weren't superheroes. Most were ordinary people living normal lives before the war, farmers, workers, teachers, merchants. But in the crucible of war, they transformed into extraordinary heroes. Subadar Richpal Ram was a farmer living in a small village in Rajasthan before the war. Gunju Lama was a shepherd boy from the mountain villages of Nepal. Duncan McIntyre was a factory worker who grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of Glasgow. But at Keren, they all became heroes. This is an inspiration for all of us. Within us lies a potential we may not be aware of, and this potential can emerge at the right time for the right purpose. The soldiers at Keren proved this. War historians, when evaluating the Battle of Keren, usually use the term forgotten victory, and this description, unfortunately, is accurate. Keren isn't as well known as Stalingrad, Normandy, or El Alamein. Most people are unaware of this battle. But this situation is beginning to change. In recent years, new books, documentaries, and academic studies about Keren have been published. Social media is helping spread these forgotten stories, and platforms like this channel are bringing Keren's story to new generations. The soldiers who fought at Keren risked their lives to save the world from the darkness of fascism. Their sacrifice enabled us to live freely today, and this sacrifice should never be forgotten. That's why, as I finish this video, I have a request for you. Share this story with others. Tell your family, friends, and acquaintances. Share it on social media. Help Keren's story reach more people, because these heroes deserve to be remembered, and remembering them is our duty. Now, as we come to the end of this series, I want to look to the future. Keren is just one of the forgotten stories of World War II, but not the only one. Around the world, there are thousands of similar stories. Most are waiting to be told. On this channel, we'll continue telling these stories. In our next video, we'll descend into the depths of Burma's jungles. There, British special forces known as the Chindits carried out incredible operations behind Japanese lines. While battling malaria, tigers, enemy soldiers, and starvation, these soldiers achieved the impossible. The story of the Chindits is as striking as Keren, perhaps even more so, because what happened in Burma shows the most brutal face of war. And you'll be able to watch this story on this channel soon. But for now, let's stay at Keren, and let's remember all the soldiers who lost their lives in this battle for just a moment. The Scottish mountaineers of the Cameron Highlanders, the Rajputana warriors of the Rajputana Rifles, the Nepali heroes of the Gurkha Rifles, the brave soldiers of the Highland Light Infantry, and the thousands of nameless souls lost in the pages of history whose names we'll never know. They died for our freedom, and we live to remember them. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your comments help us reach more people with this content. And remember, history lives on as long as it's told. Keren, 1941. Never forget. See you in the next videos. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.